morning, everyone. I'm Richard Tucker, Executive Director of Jefferson Land Trust. On behalf of the board and the staff of Jefferson Land Trust, I welcome you to our 2022 Conservation Breakfast. We acknowledge that the Land Trust, the lands we work, are those that belong to our Indigenous neighbors of Jefferson County. And we honor that tradition, and we work to build a deeper partnership with each of the different tribes in our area. I'm very honored to introduce Lonnie Greninger, who is the Vice Chairwoman of the Jamestown Squaxin Tribe, who will offer a blessing.
Ait squachi siam nisjaya siam. Yuchsia and sna statitlam nusk ayamsin. Good morning, honored friends and relatives. I am so happy to welcome you to the Jefferson Land Trust Conservation Breakfast for 2022, Listening to the Land. My name is Lonnie Greninger, and I am a Jamestown Squaxin citizen, and I currently serve my people as the Vice Chairwoman on the Jamestown Squaxin Tribal Council. What you see before me today is just a fraction of the bounty that we are afforded on this beautiful earth, which we call Shitunkwang. And what you can see in front of me is we have bounty from the animal skins that allow us to play our instruments. It also afforded us to be able to fish and have fish floats for our nets. We had their furs to keep us warm and to give us sacred regalia so that when we danced and when we sang and when we performed our ceremonies, we could cover ourselves in the right way and honor the Creator and the creation in the right way. You can see that we had bounty from the trees, our hats, our canoes, our homes, our art, our carving, our tools, our totems, our story poles, and our house poles, all came from the grand red cedar tree, what we call chapait. All of these things have been able to afford us the many wonderful things that we have. Our musical instruments, our paints come from the oils of fats from the animals around us. Our plants and our birds and our seashells have been able to afford us tools for prayers and ceremony. You can see here the sage plant, and we use the feathers to be able to whisk this smoke and cleanse the air and the people around us so that we have good thoughts and good spirits moving forward. I should even comment here, more bounty from the sea. This particular feather wand is wrapped in seaweed, dried seaweed. Seaweed was also an amazing resource for the Nuskayam, the Squaxin people. It allowed us to not only see the water highways, but it allowed us to make fish hooks, fish lines. And in fact, one of the fun pieces of seaweed is that when you're kids, you're able to throw it at one another. So we had fun games together as kids. These are the beautiful bounties. Like I said, just one sliver of the bounty that this wonderful Shitunkwang, this earth, offers us. So as we gather at this breakfast this morning, continue to think about this theme. Everything that is here, everything that is made, came from the Shitunkwang, the earth. The very fabrics come from the earth. The wood of our tables comes from the earth. And the very bounty that we eat and that nourishes our entire bodies from our emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical self. We get to take that energy from the earth and expand it in good work moving forward. So with that, I would like to go ahead and offer a prayer in Nuskayam Mutsun to get us further started in a good way. And I ask that you please pray in your own way and according to your own spirit. Masi chichai sit siam, Masi chichai sit siam, Creator, we lift your name. Hatning statia manua a ich squachi, we thank you for this beautiful day, Creator. Hatning statia manua a ich squaquite, we thank you for the beautiful sunshine, Creator. Hatning statia manua a ich shitankwang, we thank you for the beautiful earth, Creator. Hatning statia manua a ich chayachach, a ich chayachach. Creator, we're so grateful for beautiful friends and relatives that are here today, and for the compassionate hearts and the wise minds that allow us to do this good work to protect the land, to remember the land, and to advocate fully for it so that we have it here for 7 generations and more generations to come. Masi chichai sit siam, Masi chichai sit siam. Creator, we lift your name. Masi, amen. Hatning sin siam nisjayaja. Thank you, my friends, and enjoy the breakfast.
Thank you, Lonnie, very much. We're very grateful for the partnership with the Jamestown Squaxin and the Port Gamble Squaxin tribes. Our next presenter will be David Brownell. David Brownell is a board member of Jefferson Land Trust. He's also the director of the North Olympic Historical Center. He also has quite a bit of experience working with the Seminole tribes of Florida and also the Jamestown S'Klallam tribes here on the Northern Peninsula. And David, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you so much for moderating today's discussion.
Oh, thank you, and thank the Land Trust for having me. Welcome, everybody. So excited to see everybody here today. I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen. And okay. Sarah, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you guys see that? Okay. So what I'm going to try to do today, I'm going to give a quick about 20-minute presentation to kind of provide a general framework on a lot of the issues and ideas that we're going to talk about today. And then I'm really excited. We have a great panel that I will introduce after my presentation. And we'll read through a couple prompts with them and get some feedback on some of these ideas. So with no further ado, we've got 30 or 40,000 years of history to cover in 20 minutes. So I'm going to dive right into it. And I'm going to start with the concept of since time immemorial, which is a phrase that you've probably heard referenced by different tribes all over this country, and is more of a concept than a simple phrase, just trying to encapsulate the depth of knowledge and the depth of time and the cultural connection that the tribes have to the landscape of North America. And so these are two attempts to define it. It's a really hard concept to define, but it's really going to be speaking to a lot of the things that we're going to go over today. And that when we talk about depth of time and depth of culture, that these relationships go back millennia upon millennia into the past. Just to provide a new frame of reference from an archaeological perspective, a lot of you, probably like myself, were taught in school the Clovis first theory, which was basically that the Clovis people, who Clovis is actually a technological term in archaeology applied to people who used large lancelet points and were hunting large mammals across the landscape in North America roughly 13,000 years ago, that those were the first inhabitants of North America. What we've seen over the past couple decades as the science has improved is that date is getting pushed back farther and farther and farther every year. I got this map from Wikipedia, sorry about that. But even this map is out of date just from 2 or 3 years ago. Last year, they confirmed dating of fossilized human footprints at White Sands National Monument in New Mexico to between 23 and 20,000 years before present. So I've circled the Manus Mastodon site, which many of you are probably familiar with here in Squim, which is a 13,800-year-old mastodon kill site. So what we're now understanding is that what happened in North America was probably very similar to what happened in Northern Europe at the last glacial maximum. These massive ice sheets pushed south from the North Pole, and people retreated in front of those ice sheets. There were people south of those ice sheets during the last ice age, much earlier than 13,000 years ago. And when those ice sheets retreated back north, the animals and the people followed them. There were also what are called glacial refugia along the Pacific Northwest coast, especially up into British Columbia and the Alaska archipelago, basically pockets along the coast where those glaciers didn't extend into certain valleys. And those valleys protected both animals and humans. And the humans were transporting themselves on boats, on canoes. So they were able to travel up and down the coast despite there being these massive ice sheets around. And we're also finding that genetic evidence is also backing up what the tribes have been saying, that they've been here since time immemorial. When we start looking at genetics, we see haplogroups that are going back far before the last ice age. So some really interesting new science coming out. So here in our little corner of the world, these are quotes from a really great report created by Olympic National Park called The Evolution and Diversification of Native Land Use Systems. But long story short, what I've highlighted here in the block in the red, you can see right after the end of the last ice age, we entered a period about 3,000 to 4,000 years of very dry, very warm climate. Then about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, the climate started to cool off. it got much wetter, and that's when the forest closed in over Western Washington, and the landscape started to look a lot more like it does today. Prior to that, it was a much more open park-like landscape with Gary oak groves, maybe some pine and spruce on the landscape, but pretty open. And people were living in relatively small groups and hunting terrestrial mammals across that landscape. As those forests closed in, it's much harder to hunt a lot of those terrestrial mammals, and a lot of the mammals don't proliferate in dark, deep forests. So that's when we see culturally and archaeologically a shift towards more of a maritime resource centric culture, and specializing in fishing for salmon and hunting marine mammals. And we see development of woodworking technology and the use of Western red cedar, which was by then prevalent. So just to note that climate change is something that has happened quite severely here on the Olympic Peninsula, and the tribe and their ancestors, they've been here, they coped with that, and they found ways to adapt and survive and to thrive in that new environment. The image on the right side of your screen is just an example of how much our sea level has shifted. 30 meters, that's well over a couple hundred feet. So it gives you an idea of, and that's this image, this graph is from the west end of the Olympic Peninsula. And so it's interesting, when that massive ice sheet retreated north at the end of the last ice age, basically the isostatic rebound meant this side of the peninsula, the east side of the Olympic Peninsula, rebounded and went up. So the sea level basically fell, versus the other side of the peninsula, the west end, started to sink, and now it started to stabilize. And you can see from that graph that the present sea level has been stable for roughly around 1,500 to 2,000 years on the Olympic Peninsula. And that's about analogous to the radiocarbon dating we get from coastal archaeological sites, because other sites would probably be out underwater somewhere. I'm going to run through a quick timeline, but this is by no means supposed to be a comprehensive timeline. There are many other sites, there are many other things that happen, but I'm trying to just encapsulate some of the important points that I wanted to touch on. Around 14,000 years before present was when the Cordilleran ice sheet retreated north off of the Olympic Peninsula. There were glacial refugia up in the Olympic Mountains. There were alpine glaciers that extended down the Dungeness and Grey Wolf valleys. And then the Cordilleran ice sheet pushed up against the north shore of the Olympic Peninsula. But there were areas between those glaciers and ice sheets where you had plants and animals, and quite likely humans, surviving and waiting that out for roughly 4,000 or 5,000 years during the last glacial maximum. Right after that ice sheet retreated, that's when the Manus mastodon was killed just south of Sequim in Happy Valley. There was a bone point lodged in that mastodon's rib, and then the cranium itself was rotated 180 degrees and smashed apart into pieces, which is something that we typically see at Pleistocene kill sites, where humans were harvesting that brain matter because it was very protein and calorie rich. There were evidence of at least 12 other levels of human occupation at that Manus mastodon site between 14,000 and 7,000 years before present. And what's great about that site is it used to be a pond that filled in, and so created sort of a boggy anaerobic atmosphere. Without that oxygen, it preserved those organic materials so we could get radiocarbon dates. 8,300 years before present is the earliest radiocarbon dates from anthropogenic paleosols, which is a scientific term for human-created soils, basically created by burning prairies over and over to keep those prairies open, to keep Douglas firs and Gary oaks from encroaching. And we'll talk about that, the importance of that more in a few slides. But that's right over on Eby's Prairie on Whidbey Island. Around 5,000 years before present, sea levels rose to within 2 or 3 meters of their current level, flooding Killisset Harbor between Indian Island and Marrowstone Island. Prior to that, it would have been a shallow valley, similar to Sequim Bay and Discovery Bay. And then we have a range of radiocarbon dates from Camas, Ovens, and Hartz over at Eby's Landing that range from 3,000 years to 300 years before present. 1,500 years before present is the earliest radiocarbon date we have from Buggy Spit, which is on the north tip of Indian Island. And again, that's not that people weren't there much earlier, but those sites would have been now, they're under the bay, they're underwater. And likewise, Wayland Point, also on Indian Island, was occupied from roughly 750 years to 200 years before present. This map kind of gives you an idea of the geographical range of Squalum village sites, all the way west on the north shore of the Olympic Peninsula to the Hoko River, north across to the very southern tip of Vancouver Island. There were Squalum villages there. And the Squalum themselves are very closely related to the Sook and Saanich and other Strait Salish tribes. They speak a language that's very, very similar to Squalum. It's almost more of a dialectical difference. And they were closely related and intermarried with those groups. And then there were villages also, coming east all the way to Katai at Port Townsend, Nukes Quite at Port Gamble. And then the Squalum frequently visited hunting and fishing camps, seasonal hunting and fishing camps down on Hood Canal, on the Quilcene, Duckabush, Dosey Wallops, and Hamahama River. And then they had reef fishing sites up along the South San Juan Islands. And there was a Squalum home site at Cattle Point on the south tip of San Juan Island. The earliest European account we have of interacting with the Squalum was in 1788. Robert Duffin encounters the Squalum as a very nice way of saying that his boat was turned into a pincushion, and he promptly turned tail and headed in the other direction. However, 2 years later, Manuel Quimper reached Discovery Bay, and it's pretty clear by that point that the Squalum had a lot of frequent interactions with European traders, because in his accounts, he talks about canoes just loaded up with elk meat, hides, seafood, all sorts of great stuff that the sailors were very happy to get after being on hardtack for quite a while. We have records of Squalum traders at Fort Nisqually down by Tacoma, and starting in 1833. The U.S. exploring expedition came through in 1841 and put together some really beautiful maps of the entire Salish Sea area. They also recorded the Squalum growing potatoes on Oak Bay and Discovery Bay. By the late 1840s, the Squalum and Chimicum tribes integrated, and this is when you start to see the growth of the village of Katai, located at Port Townsend. The Chimicum, by all accounts, were never a very numerous tribe. They were relatively small, and through repeated impacts from both conflicts with other tribes and then the epidemics that came through, the new introduced diseases were reduced in number, and so integrated with the Squalum. And that's where we see the village of Katai start to grow there at Port Townsend. In 1851, the first immigrants of European and American, Euro-American descent arrived at Katai in Port Townsend. And then in 1855, the Squalum, Chimicum, and the Tawana tribes signed the Treaty of Point No Point. The Squalum ceded somewhere over 2 million acres of their territory to the United States government, reserving the right to hunt, fish, and gather plants in their usual and accustomed territory. The federal government made promises to the tribes of money, materials, and support that were decades from coming. And in that treaty itself, the treaty lists Katai as the Squalum capital, which is probably a reference to Chief Cheechmahan living there and sort of him being the most notable chief of the Squalum people. And at that time, the Gibbs recorded a census of somewhere around 926 Squalum. Best estimates in terms of pre-contact was that there were originally around 2,500 to 3,000 Squalum located in those villages I showed on the maps, making them the most numerous tribe in this area, the largest tribe in this area. Moving more into the historic period, you can see by 1859 that the village of Katai was down to around 200 Squalum. We have a record from around this time of the bark what cheer infecting the Squalum at the village of Chiquing on Washington Harbor with smallpox. Captain Thompson, who was the captain of the what cheer, is actually buried at Thompson Spit on the Gardner Peninsula, if you've ever been out there. In 1860, James Swan recorded 18 Chimicum lodges and 14 Squalum at Point Hudson or Katai. And then in 1867, the city of Port Townsend actually passed an ordinance against the building of new Indian homes in Port Townsend. The Squalum, under the leadership of Chief Cheechmahan, appealed to the federal government to make Indian Island the Squalum Reservation. The federal government tried to make the Squalum, the Chimacum, and all of the various Tawana bands move to the Skokomish Reservation. But it was impossible for the Squalum and Chimacum to continue fishing and hunting in their usual and accustomed territories when they were living on a reservation that was located hundreds of miles to the south. So there's a lot of resistance from the start of that idea of moving away from the place where your ancestors have been for thousands and thousands of years. For that reason, in 1874, a group of Squalum families under the leadership of Chief James Balch purchased 210 acres of land north of Squim for $500 in gold coin. And basically the family lots were apportioned by how much gold coin each family contributed. And they named that settlement Jamestown in honor of that Chief James Balch. So that's where Jamestown gets its name. No connection to Virginia. We get that question a lot. And this picture that I have in the background is great. This is some of the original founders of that Jamestown community. So just a great shot there that was taken in the 1920s when those original founders were starting to get into their elder age. I mentioned the Port Townsend Ordinance. In June 21st, 1881, Chief Cheechmahan passed away. He laid in state in Port Townsend for 3 days and was honored greatly by the residents of Port Townsend, and was buried in Laurel Grove Cemetery. In 1887, the Allotment Act transfers the title of land retained by the tribes to individual tribal citizens. So basically, any reservation land that had been allotted to tribes that wasn't settled by a specific tribal family was then basically just sold off again. So greatly reducing the number of acreage of reservation land available to the tribes. In 1871, so roughly 4 years after the ordinance banning houses, Indian agent Edwin Eales arrived and worked with city authorities on August 23rd to dismantle the remaining longhouses at Katai. They took those families in their canoes and they towed them down to the Skokomish Reservation, but within about 2 weeks, most of those families had returned to either Indian Island, Port Hadlock, or Port Gamble. In 1891, we have this great record of the last potlatch held here on Port Townsend Bay, which is on July 4th, 1891 by Old Patsy, who is actually from the Squaxin tribe, worked up at a sawmill north of here, moved back to Hadlock, and then his son, young Patsy, married Lucy Dexter from Jamestown, and their descendants, the Patsy family, are Jamestown tribal citizens today. And what was really great is Patsy bought over 100 feet of sailcloth in Port Townsend, and he used that to roof the potlatch house where he hosted his potlatch. And so unlike a lot of other potlatches where we might have some images from outside the longhouse, but inside where it was very dark and dim, there's really no photography. We have these great images showing the potlatch, the gambling activities, the dancing activities, the gifting that were going on at that potlatch. And so and during that account, it's interesting, they said that there were hundreds of folks from different tribes all over the Salish Sea who came to that potlatch, who first went over to Port Townsend and enjoyed the 4th of July festivities there. And then the residents, the non-native residents of Port Townsend, came over to the Hadlock potlatch and enjoyed the potlatch with them. So a cool intercultural connection there. So rolling on into the modern era, the Navy acquired Indian Island through eminent domain. The remaining families moved to Hadlock or Jamestown or Little Boston at Port Gamble. In 1939, the Port Gamble tribe achieved federal recognition. In 1968, the Lower Elwha tribe achieved federal recognition. In 1981, the Jamestown tribe achieved federal recognition. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is traditional ecological knowledge, which is a term that's applied to, I really like this definition from ATNI, which says that traditional ecological knowledge is an accumulation of centuries of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. And we're seeing a shift today, both in federal agencies and just in sort of general philosophical understanding of the importance of both qualitative knowledge and quantitative knowledge and data. So most of Western science is based in quantitative data, things that you can calculate, but qualitative data is what's passed down through oral histories, through millennia and centuries of experience of living on the landscape and passing that knowledge and traditions down to younger generations. This map is just showing you some of the prairies that used to be on our landscape. And these prairies, I'll talk about this on the next slide, were kept open through a burning cycle that the tribes used every 2 to 3 years to keep the landscape open. These prairies are the last remnant of that late Holocene landscape. I just want to check my time here and make sure I'm okay. That late Holocene landscape that I mentioned after the last ice age, when it was much warmer and drier and the landscape was much more open and park-like. As those forests close in, it was incredibly important for the tribes to start burning these prairies to keep the Douglas firs and the baby Gary oaks and the other tree saplings from encroaching, closing those prairies in, and eliminating an incredibly important food and resource for the tribes. This is a slide from Dave Peter at the U.S. Forest Service, who's done a lot of great work with Stan Graham documenting Olympic Peninsula prairies and coming to a better understanding of what they are and why they're important. But you can see here, he's noted specifically where people are very important of the natural fire cycle and processes here on the Olympic Peninsula. Once you remove the people, once you remove the tribes, you're removing a critical element from processes that have been going on since the end of the last ice age. And we're starting to see that impacts now as our prairies are greatly reduced, mainly by Douglas firs closing in simply because they haven't been burned back. We're also seeing along the West Coast increasingly bad catastrophic fires because we're seeing a buildup of fuel on forest floors because this fire cycle has been interrupted for about 200 years now. And that's let a great deal of fuel accumulate on forest floors. The fires burn hotter, they burn faster, and it's much harder to deal with them. And this map is where people's eyes tend to get kind of big because this is showing you the approximate extent of some of these catastrophic fires. And you can see that they're relatively regular, similar to the Cascadia earthquake cycle that's roughly every 300 to 500 years. There's a catastrophic fire cycle, and those tend to predominantly burn the northeast side, the northeast half of the Olympic Peninsula because it's drier, it's warmer. You know, there's hundreds of inches of precipitation out on the west end that keep it from burning very frequently. But on the Quimper Peninsula through Sequim and all the way to Port Angeles, fire was a pretty frequent issue that the tribes had to deal with. This top left corner image is an image from the Katai Prairie there in Port Townsend at the entrance to the Port Townsend Golf Course. The camas bloom is like late May to early June. Highly encourage folks to check it out if you haven't ever been there. And that Katai Prairie is unfortunately really the last intact remnant camas prairie that I'm aware of on the northeast part of the Olympic Peninsula. Unfortunately, just about everywhere else, camas was wiped out primarily by introduced livestock. Pigs love to go out and dig up camas and eat those tasty little bulbs. And so just about anywhere that there was a farm with livestock, camas and a lot of those native prairie plants disappeared off the landscape. This quote is from a really, really interesting report that just came out last year, and it from Simon Fraser University and UBC up in British Columbia. And this primarily applies to village sites in sort of more of a forest habitat, forest environment. But I would argue that this also absolutely applies to prairies around village sites. What they found was that forests managed by Indigenous peoples in the past, still today, after a century or a century and a half of the native Indigenous habitants not being at that village site, those village sites still provide more diverse resources and habitat for animals and pollinators than naturally forested ecosystems. So we're starting to re-examine the idea of what exactly agriculture is and how the tribes actually did practice forms of agriculture and arboriculture on the North American landscape, and specifically in the Pacific Northwest, even though for a very long time they've been termed a non-agricultural society. Another reason why we see the great development of technology, cultural and spiritual development of tribes in the Pacific Northwest, despite them not being a typical sedentary agricultural society, was because they were so good at preserving foodstuffs like camas for late winter when there's not many other resources on the landscape. And so instead of having to spend your winter hunting through the frozen forest trying to find limited food resources, in your longhouse, you've got smoked salmon, you've got smoked clams, you've got dried camas, you've got all sorts of dried roots, preserved berries, all of the, this immensely wealthy resources that we have on this peninsula, and they would preserve those for winter. So these are just some great shots that I took over my years working with the Jamestown tribe on some of the traditions that are continuing there. You can see a great shot of Mac right there in the middle. We're digging some Lomatium nudicoli or biscuit root, which is a great food plant. Top right image was when we visited the Chimacum Ridge Forest and did some exploring out there and plant identification in that area. The bottom right image is my mother-in-law, Lisa Burrell, Emma's mother, collecting cattail and the fuzzy part, I can't remember the name of it, out on Indian Island. The bottom left image is Jamestown tribal citizen Jeremy Monson teaching tribal youth how to peel and gather Western red cedar bark on Indian Island. We frequently work with the US Navy there, and they allow the tribe to come on and harvest traditional resources. And then the top left image is a really cool project we did earlier this year. A developer is unfortunately slated to develop one of the last 7-acre patches of intact prairie located in Sequim. So we spent the spring and summer flagging a lot of the traditional native prairie plants. And then we went out there this fall, once those plants went into their dormant cycle, dug them all up, and then transferred them to the Dungeness River Center, where the Jamestown tribe is engaged in a prairie restoration project where we're trying to reestablish a healthy camas prairie to return to being able to return to those traditional camas gathering activities. So I will pause there. I will stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel members one by one. Make sure I got everything running here. I will go ahead and introduce our panel members, and then we will go ahead and do a little round robin. So first off, I want to introduce Emma Brownell, who's my lovely wife and from the Johnson family of the Jamestown Slalom tribe. Emma actually grew up on the family property that was originally purchased by Joe and Lily Johnson in 1874 when they founded Jamestown. And she is currently the Traditional Foods and Culture Program Assistant at the Jamestown tribe. Next, I'd like to introduce Kathy McGregor, who's a Jamestown tribal elder from the Lambert Reyes family and a descendant of Yawitsa, the daughter of Chief Statithlam. And Kathy is an expert basket weaver who got to come out on the first ever cedar gathering from the Land Trust first harvest last year, which was very exciting. So glad to have you, Kathy. Next, I'd like to introduce Closton, Mackenzie Grinnell from the Prince family at Jamestown. Mackenzie is the Traditional Foods and Culture Program Coordinator at Jamestown and is a direct descendant of Chief Cheechmahan, also known as Chetzemoka, who you guys may be familiar with. And then finally, I would like to introduce Sarah Spaeth, who's the Director of Conservation and Strategic Partnerships with Jefferson Land Trust. Sarah works closely with landowners and community members, as well as governmental and nonprofit agencies to shepherd land projects through to protection. And I got to work a lot with Sarah in my time at the tribe, and now I've continued working with her, and it's always a pleasure to spend time with you out in the field. So without further ado, thank you panelists for being here. We'll dive right into it. And my first question for you is, what are some examples of traditional ecological knowledge that are meaningful in your life and culture? Anybody can go first.
I guess I'll go first. I'm the only one unmuted. I'll take that hint.
Unmute.
Yeah, traditional ecological knowledge, it's like I learned about this term in university, and it's been coming up a lot more now than working in our traditional foods program. But it was just, the lessons and the teachings that my grandma and my parents and aunts and uncles would teach me as we would go out fishing or harvesting and things like that. But and it's like all the small things that as a kid I just kind of took for granted. It's like, oh, I learned this and now this is how you're supposed to harvest. I learned this, now this is how you're supposed to walk through the land. So for example, when you go harvest clams, you don't take the tiny ones because those grow into bigger clams. You come back and harvest those. And same thing when you're harvesting camas too. You harvest in a way that promotes the growth of everything that you're harvesting. So with clams, you turn up where the clams are living, you leave the smaller ones, you thin out the population, and then more clams can keep growing. With camas, when you dig it up, you break off all the little tiny rootlets or bulblets, and you aerate the soil, and when you come back, there's more camas. And so in that way, I guess that's the traditional ecological knowledge that we were an additive to the land, or maybe that's not the right word, but yeah. Emma or Kathy, what do you?
I think that was the right word.
I just wanted to say that you talked about the animals, the shellfish, and plants are the same. You want to do careful harvesting so that they'll regrow and become stronger. If you clear cut, you lose everything. But if you selectively take only what you need, the forest will continue to regrow.
Yeah, and harvesting so that when you step back and take a look at where you've been and what you've been harvesting, you can't tell you've been there.
Right.
And I think, like David was saying, that there's that study that came out from Simon Fraser University's last year about our forest gardens and things like this, that, we've been like, well, this is how we've been doing it, and our forests have been thriving, and that's the way you should be doing it. But there's also things that, maybe we might not know of the full impact. For example, like some of our ceremonies, like for specific example, like our salmon ceremony, when salmon come back to the river, come back to us, and we catch our first salmon, we give thanks to the salmon people and send some of the remains back out. And sorry, I have a puppy right here, and she just woke up. What was I saying? The first salmon ceremony, and what does that do? That welcomes back the salmon, and that makes sure that they always have a place to come home. And so why do we always have salmon? It's because our ancestors made that promise to the salmon people to always take care of the rivers and the waterways, and that they would take care of us in return.
I think I'm just really thankful for this conversation and for this learning. I feel like our community and the Land Trust are so ready to understand what this traditional ecological knowledge is that our local Indigenous tribes have to share. And I think that it's kind of a national, regional, local trend for us to recognize that the Indigenous people have been managing these lands for time immemorial. That I think that the the early European understanding was not that. They thought that it was just wildlands. And so to learn from you about this is such a really important part of understanding our landscape and how we can work with the tribes to protect those things that are important to you and to all of us as well. So really appreciate this.
Oh, those were great answers. Before the next question, I forgot to mention earlier, I'm sure folks are going to have questions about the presentation or questions for the panelists. Please just type those into the chat box at the bottom, and we're going to save a couple minutes at the end to try and get to those. Okay, so our next question is, in what ways does your connection with the landscape strengthen your relationship with your culture and your ancestors?
that the first question? Again?
No.
I know with my basket weaving, going out in the forest and harvesting bark, it's the tools we use are still the same, real similar to the tools our ancestors used. And that just flows a connection with me. I feel the ancestors are guiding my hands sometimes. So it's a real close connection for me. Come on, somebody else.
Well, I know that working with Cedar with Kathy and learning more of these things really strengthens that connection. And some of these things that I, like Mac was saying earlier, maybe didn't think about a whole lot when I was a kid when I was learning them. But now as I'm working with this program and kind of getting more in touch, I'm appreciating it a little bit more. And go ahead, Mac.
Well, I can say one more thing.
Yeah.
Cedar is considered the tree of life for us. And it provided clothing, housing. It kept us safe since time began. No, David?
Sorry, I had somebody poke their head in.
Yeah.
Apologies.
But with cedar being the tree of life, it not only provided basket weaving material, provided clothing and housing for us in the longhouses. It was just such an essential tree for us that it was important. We also used it for our canoes. It was important to conserve those and make sure we always had some. And I think our ancestors learned how to do that. Sorry, Matt.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I guess to go off of that, you know, we're still getting into our canoes and we're going across these waterways and we're still going out into the forests and harvesting and following these old trails that were made hundreds of generations ago. And our ancestors have been here for hundreds and hundreds of generations. When we step out our door and we get on our canoes, we're walking, we're pulling in the same waters, walking on the same lands that our ancestors did. And their actions are very present in those, on those waterways, in those forests, in the mountains. And you know, if you're paying attention, you can hear those stories. You can see what they've done for us and to make sure that we can continue living here. And so I guess when I walk through a forest, it's, you know, like walking back in time. You walk through these giant old growth trees, and those are the trees that our ancestors walked under. You walk up into the mountains and you see these rock formations. Those are the same rock formations that our ancestors looked up at, told stories about. And all of that connects me to my ancestors, connects me to this land, and I'm sure with you know, the rest of our community too. It's, you know, we just had such a long history, as David kind of briefly went over, that it's hard. You know, you could close your eyes and point at something and there's a story about it. You close your eyes and point at something and you know, our ancestors were there.
Well, I think a lot of us here online today and in Port Townsend and on the peninsula are a lot more recent transplants to this place. And that I think that many of us long for that deep connection and legacy that the Indigenous people have here. And for me, kind of becoming connected to place here has really benefited from working with the Land Trust, because I've gotten to know the landscape and I've gotten to know some of the people, and I appreciate the connection that some of our community has through food that's grown here, that we recognize that the land provides us food, that we recognize that the local forests are providing wood products that we build our houses with. And then personally, I've really become fascinated with wildlife tracking over the last 10 years or so, and recognizing how important the landscape is for our wild brethren, and that it's so critical that we continue to maintain, in partnership with tribes, the habitat corridors that provide transit for these animals, that provide us clean water, that provide us trees for clean air to breathe. And I think that all of those are part of what connects us to place.
I think our first food ceremony is quite important, because once a year at the beginning of, I'm not sure when it is,
The beginning of winter.
winter,
Yes.
we give thanks to the animals, the shellfish, the sea, the forests, and we share gratitude for them enabling us to continue to live. And once a year is probably not even often enough that to remind us that we have a lot of bounty provided for us, and it's at a cost, and we need to be thankful that they're willing to give up their life or part of their growing cycle to enable us to survive.
Next, we were wondering what impacts and changes to traditional resources have challenged your gathering or other cultural practices during your lifetime?
Just our lifetime?
Well, I mean, I guess the changes could have happened before your lifetime.
I think there have been a lot of changes. I mean, if you look at the maps that David was showing pictures of earlier, of where the prairies used to stand throughout Squim, I mean, Squim and the Olympic Peninsula was essentially a large prairie. And if you look around now, you don't see that. So I didn't harvest camas for the first time until last year, and traveled to Whidbey Island, where I was able to do that and or participate in a traditional camas bake. But those sort of resources, not like having to travel to find that camas and to learn these things, but with different work, like with the prairie restoration work that we're doing, hopefully future generations will have that opportunity, both here locally and places like Whidbey Island, San Juan Islands.
I know cedar is getting more scarce for basket weavers to find. And some of the berries that were traditionally used, we're having to go farther and farther to source them. So we've lost a lot of our habitat.
Yeah, I also think that the forestry practices with that is impacting the cedar. It's impacting so many different things. But then, you know, after these clear cuts come through, they spray pesticides and herbicides and things like that, and then they monocrop the trees that are most valuable. And you know, as our forests aren't supposed to be just one plant or one tree or one ground covering or one anything. It's supposed to be hundreds of different things. And so, you know, I hope you've all seen or gone to an old growth forest, and there you can see those multiple levels of canopy. You can see the brush, you can see below the brush in the moss and in the dirt, there's so many different plants and animals in a healthy forest that, you know, especially right around where we all live next to the waters, it's been logged the most. Once you get higher in the mountains, it's a little more tricky to log. And a lot of those places have been logged before, but even second growth forests don't contain the same things that we're used to harvesting. And then, you know, once we try to get up into the mountains, then there's these borders are created from parks and preserves and things like that, where, you know, we've always been a part of this landscape that's what we've been talking about, that we've been here forever. This land, our ancestors were a part of this land. And now that there's these preserves that are separating humans and nature, and that mindset is changing, like as David is saying, but it's still there, it's still persistent, where, you know, these forests are, and these prairies are becoming sick, and there's nobody going up there and being a part of it, or no one. There's Native peoples, S'Klallam peoples, Twana, aren't able to go up there and participate and be a part of the forest, be a part of the prairies. Yeah, so forest practices and borders, let's say.
It's also getting more difficult to find our medicinal plants out in nature.
Mhm.
And I think some of this is due to people coming in and just taking everything and not leaving any plants behind. It's been shown that if you selectively harvest, all the plants that grow afterwards are stronger.
I think that's a big reason why a lot of Native folks, me included, don't show non-Native folks where and what and how to harvest, because, you know, we've had enough examples of showing people how to harvest, and they go up and they just take away all of those resources. They don't know exactly how to harvest, or they don't have that relationship, or so then when we go back up there, like, well, it's gone. I guess we're not going to tell people about these things anymore. And I think that, you know, as community members in our community at large, that has to be something that you all have to accept. Like Sarah was saying, that, you know, a lot of people have this urge to be more connected to the land. And I guess you all need to prove that to us, because I don't, you know, we've all, as Native peoples, we've been burned, I guess, metaphorically and literally. And that trust has been broken so many times over that, you know, our traditional ecological knowledge is beneficial. So like on Chimacum Ridge, they're working on a forestry plan to create those different levels of canopy and create the understory and everything. And our traditional ecological knowledge is one of the main tools, but some of our traditional ecological knowledge is our own because it's been taken advantage of before.
We also have a philosophy of looking forward 7 generations, which a lot of people don't think that far. And so if you're out gathering, you want to think about 7 generations from now. That's a long time. And that's been one of our traditions that I think everyone could adapt to. I think one of the problems is we live in a capitalistic society, which means more, more, more. And I know so many people who have a closet full of cedar bark, yet they don't know how to weave. It's a closet shrine or something. But it would be beneficial if they would donate it to somebody who could weave or something, you know. I don't know.
I think that, we recognize that the landscape has been irrevocably impacted by European colonization, and that relationship to land that came here was really based on extractive principles. And that we still see that today, as you're saying.
Mhm.
And that was also sort of the foundation, along with that attitude that there wasn't management by the indigenous tribes, that
Right.
land needs to be set aside and preserved from no touch. And
Mhm.
we're really recognizing that is, once again, not what the landscape was. It was managed by the first peoples. And that we need to shift that attitude from extractive principles to this concept that we manage in concert with the land and the resources, and we try and improve the quality of those resources, and benefit all species in doing so. And I think that's a new concept, really, for this community. And I think we are just really starting to learn what that means. And I know, like you mentioned, the Chimacum Ridge Community Forest. It's kind of an example that the Land Trust is really trying to model, is that we can do this in a different way. That we need to learn from the tribes. We need to include the tribes in these management decisions and access, so that we're beginning to right some of those historical wrongs.
I love where this conversation is headed because it segues perfectly into my next question, which is a two-part, and you don't have to answer both, but if you want to, you can. What do the terms stewardship and reciprocity mean to you personally? And what traditional belief or idea do you wish that more people were aware of?
I guess I can start this one. I guess as we've been talking, about our history here on this land, that stewardship, I think this is a underrepresentation of what we do, where like it seems like stewardship is, I don't know, like almost like gardening compared to farming compared to like a ranch, I guess, in like a Western agricultural mindset, where what we do with stewardship goes way beyond that, because we have this relationship with the land that goes beyond I guess okay, reset. I think I guess I assume that stewardship has like an extractive connotation, where we need to steward these forests, we need to steward this landscape so that we can pull more out of it, or I guess extract in a different way that's not as bad, where I guess for us as Native peoples, it was never really stewardship, it was just being in that relationship, which stewardship has that idea. And maybe I'm just thinking too much about this a little bit, but as we've been saying, like our ancestors have been here since forever, and our ancestors took care of or were part of the forest, and these forests are the descendants, and we're the descendants of our ancestors, and we're still in this community. And our ancestors made those promises to the salmon, made those promises to the forests and the prairies. And as the descendants of our ancestors, it's our responsibility to uphold those promises.
I don't see Native traditional ways as a stewardship. It's more recognizing that while they're not people, like forests, they have a network with roots and can talk of impending fire or share information. And our ancestors recognized that they are beings in a certain way.
Yeah.
And so we work together. Stewardship to me implies that, oh, I'm coming in here and showing you how to do it. And I think just that basic approach is different. And I think our ancestors had so much time before them that it became common sense to follow certain practices rather than what we do now.
Yeah, so less stewardship of the earth and more reciprocity with it.
Yes. Thanks, Emma.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate what you just said, because I think that the land trust feels like stewardship has been kind of at the core of our mission for a long time, you know, particularly in helping to restore salmon habitat and yet the concept of reciprocity, which I thought Robin Wall Kimmerer captured so beautifully in Braiding Sweetgrass,
Yes.
is a whole different take on how we care for the landscape and the plants and the animals and the bugs and the bees and I feel like it's a mind shift that we need to take in the work that we do, that we all in this community need to embrace, that we can make a difference by giving back.
Mhm.
And that's going to take place differently for all of us, but we need to recognize that we have that role in how we care for the land and for this place.
Mhm.
Thank you. This has given me a lot to think about too.
Yeah, I even brought Braiding Sweetgrass just in case I wanted to refer to it.
Yeah, my copy too.
That's a good book. I gave my copy away. I need to get another one.
Right. I mean, I've given 2 of them away.
We all have that.
So my final question is a little awkward after this conversation that we just had, but maybe we can find a way to rephrase stewards. What advice or direction would you give to community members who wish to be better stewards of our North Olympic landscape? So maybe instead of stewards, just residents of our North Olympic landscape.
I think before you do. We have a lot of invasive plant species, and perhaps we need to look at using native plants instead of grass lawn. Lawns are one of my big things.
Yes. That is my thinking too, Kathy.
Yes, lawns are pretty sometimes.
Yeah, that's it.
But they use a lot of water. They use energy to maintain them. It's not a wise use of the land. And this is just my opinion. And think about native plants. Research what you're doing before you do it. And see what people before you used. Because that might be a good idea.
We could all change our lawns into mini prairies.
Yes.
Ah,
Easier maintenance, plants that are native to here, useful.
You get flowers at different times of the
Yeah, all year,
year.
for summer at least.
Yes.
I think that, yeah, just plant, dig up your yard, plant a prairie. That's a very tangible thing that we can all do. Or, maybe not in your whole yard, just a patch of it,
Right.
I will admit I like laying down in a grassy lawn in the summer.
Put a blanket down.
Yeah, let's put it down. Yeah, never mind. Turn your whole yard into a prairie. But I think, something more, or I guess less tangible is like just having conversations about, what nature and like what this territory and this land is, and trying to separate this idea that we've all been ingrained with, that humans are separate from nature, because that's never been the reality. And I think that will go a long way if you have those conversations with, or you think about yourself, have conversations like that with your friends and family, so that, because that would help us as Native peoples start breaking down that stigmatism that, like, what are you doing in this national park? We're like, oh, I'm harvesting illegally. Never done that, I like to say. But also, also that gives me another point, is that this last, or I guess through COVID, none of us have been able to meet inside, and the popularity of going into national parks and going camping, things like that, has exploded. Our national parks are seeing hundreds of thousands of more people a year or a month, I don't know. And people are getting these permits to go back into the backcountry, and that leaves no permits, that leaves less access for us to go up there to harvest our medicinal plants, harvest cedar, or just go up there and learn these stories from the land and listen to our elders as they tell us as we walk through the forests. And I don't know how to change that. I guess I'm putting this out there. If anybody has an idea, I don't know if we reserve permits, or I don't know. That's an idea. Pick up trash also.
Don't leave that dog poop bag that you're gonna pick up on your way back out.
Yes.
But picking up trash, like, it's unbelievable, as there's folks going along the highway picking up trash, and then they mow it, and we're like, oh my God, how's that much trash accumulated in a few months or in a year, but that's also in camping areas, less so in the park, but in like the national forest, where there's dispersed camping, there's always beer cans, there's always trash you can pick up. That's something that I always try to do, is when I go up and harvest something, also take trash back with me, because that's also feeding, it's I guess taking the garbage out of the land is feeding the land in a way. Yeah.
I think one thing that we as humans have done is to select certain animal species and say, oh, I'm thinking of deer, the big brown-eyed animals that are real, to me, in a rural setting, deer are kind of like rats with long legs. And to exterminate their predators is not always a good idea. The deer and the wolves are always being discussed, and they cause trouble to cattle. I mean, it's an ongoing debate. I notice in Port Townsend, though, there's a plethora of deer. And I'm not sure that's such a good idea. I mean, yeah.
You fiddle with one population and the other one's gonna boom, like the rats with hooves or deer.
Or seals.
Yes.
In the 60s,
Yes.
there was a bounty on seals, and so most of the seal population was wiped out, and then the Mammal Protection Act happened in the 70s, and they've been protected since then, and now their population has swung back the other way. But with that Protection Act, that also impeded on our rights to hunt seals.
Mhm.
So I don't, if you're a lawyer, you can work on that. That'd be nice.
And that had impacts on the salmon populations too, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
I want to save just a couple minutes here for questions. Thank you all again so much for being here and for all of this information. This was amazing, and I learned quite a lot in the last 30 minutes. So again, folks, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box, and then Blaze is going to feed them to us. And I'll put in a quick plug. If you're interested in more presentations like what I talked about earlier, please check out the North Olympic Histories Center's website, which is in the chat box. We have a Learning Our Landscape presentation series exploring a lot of this stuff. Just like last week, Mac did a plant walk on the Discovery Trail, which was amazing. And with such a resounding success, we're going to have to drag them back again because everybody wants a part 2, and there's always more plants to talk about. So I will pause there and let's see what questions we've got. Hi, Blaze.
Thanks, David, and everyone. Thanks for sending in so many great questions. We can tell that people are listening closely, and so I'm here sifting through all the questions coming in and seeing if there's any connections to be able to answer multiple people's questions at once. And I think the first one that I'll start with is that people are really, I think, feeling inspired by hearing about your deep connection to land and to plants specifically, but also hearing, especially from you, Mac, of making sure that we're, as non-native people, if we're feeling inspired to be connected to the land, to do that in a respectful way. So as non-native people, where would you, from your perspective, where would you recommend that we start when we have this desire to be more connected to the lands, as you've been talking so much about today?
Ooh, that's a well, I guess first off, I don't know. Which I don't know if that's definitely not helpful, but you know, I guess to try to put myself in y'all's shoes, I guess just being out on the land more often definitely helps. And you know, even just walking down the Discovery Trail or the the trails in Port Townsend area. Yeah. But doing that regularly and seeing the plants as they change, and you know, being able to notice those things, I think for me, as I since I moved back and I'm learning all about our traditional foods and harvesting and all these things at such an accelerated rate over the last few years, noticing those small things in the plants and how they act has definitely strengthened my connection to the land. And so, you know, it's like right now, you'll see these tiny little, like even just in your driveway, I have these tiny, insy wincy little white flowers that if you're just walking to your car, you won't notice. But now that I have a puppy, there's, you know, little dog bones everywhere, and I have to pick them up. And I bent down, and they're so small. They're like the size of the head of a pen. And just noticing that. And then as I walk through a field, I see those flowers again. And as I walk down the trail, I see those flowers again, and just seeing those connections of where all those live. And then also noticing where they don't live. Yeah, so I guess, I don't know, but yeah, go for walks and try to notice more things and walk slower.
I might suggest going to the prairie in Port Townsend, and there's a great information board. You can study the plants, you can see, go often and see how the plant changes and how it grows and how it's useful and natural in our area.
And I'll put in a quick plug for the Jamestown Tribal Library. Has a great website with a ton of resources on it. I'll actually post a link in at the bottom that goes to just the page that's about ethnobotany alone. And that's a great place for folks to start doing their research. There's also the House of Seven Generations, which is the Jamestown Tribe's online museum, which is another great place to sort of start doing your own research and better understanding the tribe's history and culture. And then there's always great volunteer opportunities out there, like the North Olympic Salmon Coalition or even the Land Trust, doing plantings and actually getting out there and doing good work on the landscape, building those connections with the landscape and with other people who care about it. So I think that those would also be great ways to start that.
Yeah, and visiting some of the land trusts preserves that are our ambassador lands. Go see the salmon spawning in the late summer and fall, and just really learn the plants and animals of our area. I think that there's a lot of information that the landscape can share with us, and I just think about how, in general, our society looks for directions via Google. That's how we navigate through the landscape, is via Google, not by looking at, where's Tamanoas Rock in relationship to the valleys? What are some of the landscape features that help us understand place?
Thank you all for that. Our next question, there's a lot of interest in your talk of, I think that you were mentioning that there's a recent disconnection from places that you can harvest yourselves, that people are interested about how they can maybe help increase access to that. Like, can people, you were describing turning lawns into prairies, but is there advice on how to do that? Or questions about, does the tribe have an access to enough local forests for cedar harvests and the berry harvests? Or is there anything that community members that are watching now can help with that you've said that there's sort of an increasing scarcity in the modern day?
Those are great questions.
Kathy, I thought you were about to say something.
It's challenging. It's very challenging. So there's there's more than two types of blackberries, but they're the mountain blackberries, which are real small, have less seeds, and are very flavorful, versus the wild blackberries that we see. But I'm not sure what to do about it.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of these barriers are they're systemic, where there's these relationships that are existent, but more bureaucratic than almost every tribal citizen wants to meander through, and that's to be able to harvest in the national forest, DNR land, or the national park.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know specifically what our community members here can do to help break down those barriers or help disassemble them. But maybe if everyone goes to like a park ranger talk this summer and raises their hand and says, hey, how are you making this land more accessible to tribes?
Mm-hmm.
I think that can have a great impact. Yeah.
I think that the Land Trust is really committed to working with the tribes and management decisions and restoring access to lands for traditional uses, and really look forward to continuing that relationship and learning from you. So that's a big part of where we hope to go in deepening our partnership with the tribes.
Yeah, I think Jefferson County Land Trust is doing a great job, and maybe you have more ideas of how to expand that past land trust land. But even with just the land trust land, we're always getting these invites, and we're so thankful for that. When we're looking at the Chimcom Ridge that you're planning on purchasing or purchased yet.
Planning on next year.
Next year, woo!
Mm-hmm.
you know, we went for a walk out there and we talked about, you know, everything that this place can be, and we're coming up with these dreams of what that land could look like again. And you know, that's the kind of relationship that we want with these other large landowners or land management areas.
Yeah, I just, I think it was in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book too, the concept of restorying.
Yes.
I just love that we here are restorying what's going to happen on this landscape.
Mhm. So one of the things you can do is support the land I'm not saying the word.
Conservancy.
Yes, thank you. Mhm.
Thank you all for that. We've had so many questions come in, but I think that we have time for only one more, and I'll leave it on sort of a personal one, unless one that is tough to answer in those broad scopes. So we have one person wondering that as a 21st century Indigenous Native person, what are the benefits to you of recognizing and living with the traditional ecological knowledge and practices of your ancestors?
I find one of the benefits that I was unaware of and I've been trying to embrace is food is our medicine. And the food around here works well with our bodies. And learning to use more traditional foods in our diet is so much healthier.
Traditional foods and plant medicines. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw where Laura Price had a question. She's quite knowledgeable from Port Gamble. I wish we could get her on.
Oh, I don't think that I got it might have come directly to you, Kathy, but if you have that question, we would love to hear it.
She raised her hand. That's what I saw.
Oh.
Raise your hand again, Laura. Yeah, I don't know.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just really quick, I know we're running out of time. When I was listening to the conversation about how can our neighbors and friends support the tribes, especially in regards to the increased scarcity of these resources that connect us to place, that continue on this generational knowledge of being able to pass on to the future generation. And I think something to consider that I would love to put on the table for people to think about is in your own homes, in your own communities, in your own properties, if you have resources that you know might need to come down, like a cedar tree or a maple or a cherry, maybe reach out to the tribes to see if they might be able to utilize that bark instead of just bringing the tree down and using it for firewood, which most people do. You know, that bark is a scarcity nowadays, and we much rather would prefer to harvest from a tree that we know might be coming down. Just because of the scarcity. We want to be good stewards. We want to be good protectors. We want to be making sure that we can maximize that life, that gift of life. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an idea. Reach out to your local tribes if you know of something that might need to be pruned or brought down, and maybe we can help you respect that living life. Thank you.
Yeah, and with that, you know, make sure that you're open for if a different timeline that you're thinking, or think of this timeline. We harvest cedar bark in May and June. So if you're planning to cut down a tree, give us a call and then cut it down in the summer or some other time. Because we get calls like at the end of summer and we're like, well, we can't pull the bark off the tree because it's just not the time of the year to do that. And you know, so be open to changing, you know, you want to be supportive of us changing, you know, having a minor inconvenience. Yeah.
Since that was the last question, I just wanted to thank everyone for giving me the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm not sure. I hope I added information and appropriate comments, but I was really blessed to be here today.
We were blessed to have you. Thanks for being here, Kathy.
Thank you,
And
Kathy.
thanks to
Mhm.
all of you again. I raised my hands to all of you, and this was great. And I think it went a long way to educating people, and hopefully puts us all on a better foot. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Rogers, who's the president of the Jefferson Land Trust Board of Directors. And thank you all.
Thank you, David. And as president of the Land Trust Board of Directors, and on behalf of my fellow board members, I'd like to raise my hands to you, to Emma, to Kathy, to Mac, to Sarah for this rich and moving conversation. We're really honored that you were willing to join us today to share your knowledge and your reflections. And our thanks also extend to the Jamestown and Port Gamble Sklallam tribes for their ongoing partnership in our work. As a land-based organization, we recognize the historical significance to the sovereign Sklallam nations of the land we work to protect. We recognize the vital importance of our continued partnership to the future of land conservation, stewardship, and reciprocity. I think it's safe to say that everyone who's been on our call today shares a deep love for the land. We come to it from different directions. Perhaps we're interested in a particular species or watershed or preserve that's close to our home. Or perhaps we're interested in specific uses like recreation, farming, education, or forestry. But an understanding of Indigenous history and the reciprocal relationship with the land enriches and redoubles our commitment to honoring and protecting the land. And it's also meaningful to me to understand that the healthy future of conservation is dependent on the full incorporation of traditional Indigenous knowledge into our practices. I'm encouraged to learn about the ways that's happening today and the potential we have to grow that practice. As we bring today's conversation to a close and think about the actions we all take to honor the land, just as the Olympic Peninsula's Indigenous people have done for centuries, it's my pleasure to invite all on this call to help steward this precious place for generations to come. Every year, volunteers contribute more than 3,000 hours of time to restore our preserves, creating habitats so that wildlife can thrive, and so many other projects. To all of you on the call who are already volunteers, thank you. If you've not yet joined, I'd like to invite you to check out a work party, contribute your skills or expertise in other ways. And I'd also like to invite you to join me in making a gift in support of this vital work. Your gift today can help the Land Trust protect the places in Jefferson County that hold deep ecological, community, and cultural significance. What would Jefferson County be without the clean waters of the Duckabush and Dosey Wallops rivers, whose salmon live and go on to feed the orcas in our communities? What would we be without Tamaulipas Rock, an iconic place sacred to local tribes, once threatened with demolition? What would we be without forested places like the Quimper Wildlife Corridor that offer refuge for wildlife, for recreation, for education? What would we be without farms like Thin River, Red Dog, Kawamoto, Midori, Kadama that sustain the local food economy? And they help build community resilience. Thanks to your support, we don't have to wonder what Jefferson County would be like without its farms, fish, and forests. We and generations to come who love this place will thrive in it because of them and thanks to you. So please join me today in making your gift to support all the work of the Land Trust. The link to donate is available in the chat and will be in an email that you receive following the event. Thank you. And I'd like to close by turning it over to, again, to the Land Trust Executive Director, Richard Tucker.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you everybody who attended today. And thank you specifically to David Brownell for your wonderful moderation and presentation. It was a very inspiring and informative conversation. I want to thank all the panelists. And Kathy, I will never think of Deer the same way again. But thank you so much for all your support. We're grateful to each and every one of you. And thank you all for attending. And once again, have a good afternoon and thank you for attending. Bye-bye.